The Waco History Podcast is sponsored by Brotherwell Brewing on historic Bridge Street in Waco.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
Welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. This is an episode on the Waco Mammoth site, one I've been wanting to do for some time, and it's a combination of a couple of different interviews that I did. The first one that you're going to be listening to is Paul Barron, and Paul Barron and Eddie Buffkin can't get enough credit for sharing their discovery of mammoth bones along the river with the rest of the world. And so this is what you're going to be listening to is from an interview I conducted with Paul Barron in October of 2009. There's a bit of an echo, and it's because we recorded this at the construction site of the Welcome Center, which in the space that eventually became the Welcome Center at the Waco Mammoth National Monument. And so this is Paul's story of a young man and a discovery he made years ago.
Well, just anything that had anything to do with hunting or fishing, or camping. As a kid, I just loved it. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be outdoors, and I learned, from walking through the woods in Texas, particularly in the spring and fall. If you're smart, you can keep your eyes on the ground. And so, in keeping with that, I was walking up the creek bed, and we had a little pistol with us that we had loaded with rat shot. And we were kind of looking for snakes, kind of exploring. But what we do is we turn over a rock or a stump, and if a snake came up from under it, we blast it with the rat shot. But we were really hoping we didn't see one when we turned the rock or the stump over. Anyway, we were.
So were you holding the gun or turning over the rock and the stump?
Well, yeah, I think I had the pistol, and Eddie was doing the stump turning. So anyway, we had a 357, but it was loaded with rat shot, so there was no danger of ricochet or anything. And even if we shot each other, the rat shot wouldn't do much damage. so anyway, we were walking up an old dry creek bed, and being down at the bottom of the creek bed, we didn't realize when we passed the borders of the property that we were authorized to be on. And we continued off of that property onto the property of a gentleman named Dr. Happencheck. And we had no idea, we weren't still on our place, on the place that we had leased. Well, anyway, there was an elevation change, and I began to climb up that elevation change in the little wash we were walking up, and a piece of what I perceived to be rock broke off in my hand. But after looking at it, I realized that it was a section of bone with a marrow section in the middle of it. And I began to look around both sides of the cut bank. I noticed a rounded sphere of bone sticking out of the bank that appeared from where I was to be perhaps the back of a human skull. So I dug it out and dusted it off and realized that it was some kind of ball and socket knee joint. And then I looked across the cut and noticed that there was a femur bone between 4 and 5 feet long and 10 or 12 inches around, still sitting in a vertical position. And at that point, I was 90% sure of what I was looking at. I looked a little further and I saw the apex of the curve of one of the tusks. Immediately dollar signs flashed in my eyes. But then after looking at it more carefully, I could see that it was shot through in little bitty cracks, and that just the act of trying to dig it out could destroy it. And definitely if you dug it out, if you tried to pick it up, it would crumble. At that point, I knew I was not equipped to move it or to try to do anything with it myself. But based on my experience with the Baylor Geology Department and my knowledge of the Strecker Museum, I knew that they would have the facilities and the expertise to properly excavate it and care for it. And I did not want it to be my secret. I wanted everybody to see it and everybody to know about it, because it was always something I was fascinated with, and I just thought that it was the most amazing thing. I just couldn't wait to tell somebody.
Yeah. Well, take me through your thought process as you start to figure out this isn't a cow, or yeah.
Well, okay, the first thing was, okay, I got a piece of bone in my hand, have no idea what it came from. And then I spot something that looks like something I'm familiar with. I thought maybe that was an Indian burial ground. So when I went and dug it out, okay, it's not a skull. It's way too big to be part of a human ball and socket. It's too big to be bovine, so what else is there? And then I looked across the creek and saw that massive femur bone. And at that point, I was fairly certain I knew what I was looking at. Then I spotted what I thought to be a tusk, and the apex of the curve, the point and the root both buried back in the bank. At that point, I was pretty confident of what I was looking at. But I took the rounded sphere, the knee joint, to David Lentz at the Strecker Museum, and I was met with not really any interest. Really, he was pretty dismissive. He said, we find that stuff all the time when we excavate buildings and foundations. And I said, well, I really think it'd be worth your time if you just come out and look at it. I said, it's big. He said, you think you have a complete animal? I said, I think I have several complete animals, and at that point, his interest peaked a little bit. And he said, well, after lunch, we'll go out there and look at it. So I waited around Baylor campus until he had taken his lunch, and he loaded up a couple of his associates, and we headed out here. And once they saw the site, they both got real quiet, but I could see in their eyes that they were definitely more than interested, And
how did you get to the site then? Did you come in?
Well, we accessed it the same way I accessed it the first time, because I really didn't even know where I was at. The only way I knew to get to it was the way I'd gotten to it. And basically, you had to drive across that creek wash to get to my sister's house. And so we parked right there in her driveway and walked down in the creek and came up the same way I'd come up. And, this was in the days before GPS and all that stuff. I had no idea where we were, but I knew how to get there. You go up this creek,
So they were speechless.
Their demeanor changed noticeably. I mean, I could see that there was awe and wonder in their eyes at the magnitude of what was there, and because usually when you hear about it, you hear of somebody found a tooth or they found a few bones. We had complete animals. It was pretty obvious that would be the case. And the more you looked, the more you saw. And it wasn't just, there was undergrowth and everything, but you look beyond that and you started seeing, after the fact, I think maybe it was on the way back to our cars, I had noticed a phenomenon with that particular bone, that the porous sections of it would gather moss and turn a greenish hue. And as we were walking back to our cars, the creek was just littered with little greenish rocks. And if you picked any one of them up, it was definitely washout material from the Mammoth side. So at that point, David Lentz and his associates were excited about the Mammoth find, and I was too.
Well, of course, as often the case, the discovery is only the beginning. Then the work began to determine what had actually been discovered. One of the individuals who was central in that work was Calvin Smith. And so I'm going to transition now to an interview I did with Calvin. I've got a local museum legend on the line with us today remotely, Calvin Smith. And if you're familiar with the Mayburn Museum, if you're familiar with the Mammoth site, if you're familiar with the Dr. Peppery Museum, pretty much the museum community in Waco or in Texas, you have a debt of gratitude to Calvin Smith, who's on the line with us. Director of the Mayburn, had a 20-year career at Baylor, not only getting things started on campus and locally, but also with the museum landscape in Texas. So he's joining us from Colorado. Thanks, Calvin, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So I want to take this story. We've talked a little bit about the early years, those early years with the Mammoth site. Talk a little bit about how, when your career kind of comes into this narrative of this kind of local treasure that had been discovered.
Well, I'll start a little bit further back because it was so important to my career, and that was that I had moved from Arkansas, where I was director of Arkansas Museum Services, to Waco with the support of Foots Clements, CEO and president of Dr. Pepper. Mm-hmm. He and others had asked me to come back and help with the Dr. Pepper Museum, which wasn't a museum. It was an old building with a hole in the roof, pigeons inside, and vagrants in the basement. So it was a real challenge, but I did a long range master plan that really encompassed the 100th anniversary of Dr. Pepper. And in the process of that, I drew up plans and thoughts and ideas and challenges really to Dr. Pepper. And they accepted it 100%. They thought it was a great process, a good idea. And then Foots Clements called me into his office in Dallas, late November or very early December. And with tears in his eyes, he said, "We're going to have to put this project off." He said, "We've just had our first leverage buyout, and the museum is not in their plans." But he said, "I promise you, we're going to do it." And but he had to let me go. And so almost simultaneously, Dr. Brown, Bryce Brown, who was then director of Strecker, called me in and said, "Calvin, I'm going to have to retire." He had some severe reaction to the chemicals that he had used for years in processing and preserving the herpetology collection. And he couldn't even go downstairs without starting to gasp for breath. And of course, downstairs of the old Sid Richardson Science Building. And I looked all over the place for a window down there and couldn't find it. It was a disaster. We had no ADA, no water, no running water. We had water, but it wasn't supposed to be down there. And so I said, "I'm interested." And within a day or two, literally, all this happened just very quickly. I had a call from the Moody Foundation in Galveston, wanting me to take the leadership on their new museum on the railroad museum down there, the train museum. Mm-hmm. And so I went down and visited, and that was a good challenge. And they offered me the best package I've ever been offered. I mean, it was just absolutely fantastic. So came back and told my wife that I'd been offered this position and how much they were going to pay me. And she said, "But I don't want to move back to the coast. We had been at Beaumont before." So I called them and told them, "Well, we sure appreciate the offer, but we're not going to do that." And they flew up and offered me even more. And I said, "Look, we just don't want to move back down there, but I appreciate the offer." I said, "Let me wait and see what Baylor does." And they said, "We'll wait too."
Wow. Yeah.
So I interviewed with Dr. Reynolds, and I was very impressed. And what turned out to be my family, literally, at Baylor, I was just really sold on getting that job. But typically, Baylor doesn't make snap decisions. So
no. Yeah.
The only time in my career I was without pay for about 3 months. They hired me on February the 2nd of '83. And I came aboard, but Bryce really didn't officially retire until September, but he never came back down in the museum but 1 or 2 times.
Now, in that meeting with Reynolds, did he cast a vision for something bigger?
Not really.
Okay.
Not really. He was, I think, open to change, but he didn't voice it.
Okay.
It was not something that he foresaw. Nor did anyone else. So I accepted the position. I came aboard, and it was, hell bent for leather for until September. I was just trying to keep the balls in the air, and trying to look at what was possible, what could be possible, and to give credit where credit was due. Bryce had thought about a new museum, an environmentally safe museum, and it was not big enough. In all honesty, it was about an exchange of space for space, and so David mentioned about November, as we best can tell, something about some mammoths up west of town, and I perked up because my background is archaeology, and I had worked at Blackwater Draw and was the first curator at the Blackwater Draw Museum, where Blackwater Draw is now a national landmark. And I was just at the very end of the excavation in 61, I guess. Yeah, 61 or 62, when I was invited there for a scholarship offer. And I went out to the site, and they had found 5 mammoths and 166 artifacts in direct association. They had been killed and butchered right there. And I said, no, I'm not going to this podunk school. I'm going out to University of Arizona. And the first check I wrote wiped me out. I had to find a job in a washateria to keep going. But I was out there 2 years, another story. But I eventually ended up back at Eastern and became the first director of our first curator. We didn't call them directors back then, of the Blackwater Draw Museum. So I was very interested in any kind of mammoth, singular or plural.
Yeah. And
so when he said they had found 5 portions of 5 mammoths, I said, when can we go out there? I said, this is very important because historically, anytime there's 5 or more mammoths together, at that point in time, humans were associated. So I saw this as a potential kill site to start with.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a little bit later, we finally got out there. And I walked up the draw from where we had gone over the fence and walked into the site. And there was a vertebrae coming out of the right side of the bank, the back side of a skull on the left side of the bank, and a tusk sticking out down close to where they had been working. So there was at least 3 more. That made 8. And well, I hate to be crude, but I about peed in my pants.
Well, talk about how unusual that was, or is.
It is very unusual because that number is staggering in the profession. Mm-hmm. I mean, singular mammoths are where you find the artifacts usually, historically again. Of course, at Blackwater Draw, we had primarily females and juveniles, but this was an incredible find. Mm. It really was. And so years ago, the museum had what they called junior naturalists, and they hadn't been very active, but David had some connections. We called them back together. We went out and started doing some preliminary reveal. It wasn't true excavation. It was just revealing what was there. And sure enough, it was good. It was, I think in the book you saw the end of a tusk sticking out and what it looked like. You couldn't tell it until I cleaned it up. Mm-hmm. Anybody that's worked with mammoths knew exactly what that was immediately. And so I decided that it was extremely important. We needed to excavate it properly. So we established a datum, which is a permanent steel rod or pipe that is placed in the ground and then triangulated so that we know exactly where it is to the rest of the world. In other words, that location becomes permanent.
I see.
And it was a race then because of weather and lack of funds and help to try to see what we had. And so if it had, I've said this before, but if it hadn't been for the understanding and interest of FM and Gloria later on, but FM Young, in trusting me to take over an old, worthless backhoe, that we wouldn't be talking about this, because we had no resources to go and try to rent or purchase a backhoe. It just wasn't there. So he loaned me, in the end, 3 different backhoes that he claimed I wore out. They were priceless, but they were worn out. I mean, it was. But I started removing the overburden, which from the base of where they were laying, that's not the base of them, because they were little, they're big animals and they were higher than that, but about 12 feet of overburden.
Okay.
And so started working on trying to get that removed and looking at what was coming out. And we did find it was an old draw that had been filled with probably 1950s, maybe a little late 40s, early 50s trash. And so we were finding tin cans and crockery and a few other modern items as we were excavating that particular portion. And got down to just above the Mammoth level, and I fortunately, in this case, grew up in the oil fields. Unfortunately, in a lot of other instances, I grew up in the oil fields. But I knew how to operate a backhoe pretty well. And so got pretty good and got down to where I knew they would be, and then backed off, and then we went down by hand. And I say by hand, that meant by trowel and brush, literally, because anytime you encounter bone that is not totally fossilized, you can scratch it very easily. You can make marks on it. So that was my primary goal, is not to, because if humans had been involved, they would have been doing some butchering.
I see.
And those marks would have been on the bone itself. So I didn't want putting marks on the bone.
Didn't want false evidence to kind of distort the findings. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was a primary objective. The second objective was to screen everything, to make sure that we caught anything that was human oriented. That'd be a scraper, a knife, a point, in some cases, rarely, but a foreshaft on a dart. Anything that might have proven that humans were part of this kill.
Mm-hmm.
Not a single thing.
Wow.
I mean, it was actually it was the cleanest site I've ever been on. Nothing but mammoths there at that point in time. But we were so fortunate. It's hard to realize that we had FM Young, but the other half of that coin is Ralph Vincent, who came in, and he was always hanging around. I don't mean that derogatorily, but he was around the museum on a fairly regular basis because of his interest.
Yeah.
He had been participatory in the Texas Archaeological Society for 30 years. And so he was always interested in what we were doing or finding or talking about. And he said, can I come out and volunteer on that? Oh, absolutely. Come on, Ralph. And at that point, just to be overly secure, I was the one that opened the gate and let people in. I was there. And that was usually every weekend.
What was the status of the property, Calvin, at that point? Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Dr. Hepmanchek owned the property at that point in time. And David had already gotten approval the first time around to excavate those mammoths, along with Narishkin, George Narishkin, was representing the geology department and did his senior thesis. They were requiring a senior thesis at that time, on the first five mammoths. Now, he did two things. Number one, he named it the Waco Mammoth site. That's what it was in his report. And secondly, he identified them as Mammutus columbii, which is the Columbian mammoth. So those two things we owe to him, as the very earliest stages of this occurred. Well, the idea that humans might be associated, I was setting up the typical archaeological square, which is usually a meter square, and then working it and leaving balks between each square. So that, and then a large bulk or untested material in various places so that you could align the stratigraphy from one point to another. Well, when you get into a mammoth, those squares are too small.
Yeah.
So I did away with that because we weren't finding anything in the screen. Now, a screen, it starts out as a quarter-inch screen, but it falls into a window screen. Now, I'll divert here for just a minute because my next excavation, which hopefully will be this summer, is on record, but I've got to get enough students. Two of my colleagues, one from France, Alberto Ezequiel, came to Blackwater Draw and said, we're not going to walk on the site. And so he put up some blocks, some cinder blocks, and put some 2x12s down. And we were working off of those 2x12s. And we were finding more stuff than we had ever found before. Small mammal bones, a bird bone or two. And then later, Rob Bonnickson, again, one of my colleagues that has passed on, he started doing the same thing, not walking on the site, but getting on boards and working the really fine material and then putting it through various sizes of screen. He was finding chips of human teeth and human hair in these sites. So we weren't at that stage yet professionally, but I had that in mind, that we were losing material no matter what, small snails or phreatophytes, whatever, it was just one of these things that I felt like we were losing, but no human activity at all. It just wasn't there. So I expanded the site fairly rapidly by not doing the squares. And we started working really toward the west and exposing more bone. We had gotten probably a total, considering the first five, about 16 animals by the end of that year.
This is the end of 83 or this is the end of 84?
84.
First year of work on it. Okay.
See, we didn't actually start on the site until the May of 84.
Okay.
Yeah. And John Fox asked if he could bring his students out. We did that. And then I was having so much pressure to announce that we had a large concentration of mammoths that I agreed finally, as long as they didn't put how to get there. In the process.
Because that's what you were getting at earlier, is really trying to control access and location to protect
Absolutely.
Do you feel like you were able to do that? I mean, do you get the sense that word got out and the site was disturbed some?
We had one instance that disturbed me, and that was all of our tools were stolen. And then there was a little bit of damage done um, to one of the specimens, and we didn't do it. So I know that somebody had gotten in. It was not difficult, believe me. I mean, at the first stages, we had no protection. So I really was trying to say, nobody say anything about where this side is. And a tooth was missing, but it was a loose tooth. It was, well, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So in the fall of 84, I believe, I'd have to look, but we had a 5.5-inch deluge all one afternoon. I was crossing over Franklin Boulevard, on the overpass, and I went straight to the site, and I couldn't get in. I mean, it was that bad. It was just like I said, a deluge. So we waited till the next morning, and we had an exceptional volunteer student. She was in anthropology, named Bonnie Moran. And so she came out. Another young man student came. One of my students came out, and then David and I. And it was a shocker because almost everything we had done right there in that first effort to identify and reveal those first 3 or 4 or 5 specimens, they were washed pretty much downstream. And the first thing I did was go up and make sure the datum stake was still secure, because we could put everything back if we could find it, because we knew where everything had been plotted in from that datum stake. Well, I had put the tractor, the backhoe, down almost to the bottom. It was sticking up like this, because I wanted to do a profile, in other words, a cross section of the material below the site to see what was happening paleontologically or geologically. And so we went down, and I was about 12 feet deep, about as deep as I could go with that backhoe. And fortunately, as a good backhoe operator usually does, he sticks the bucket in the dirt, and then lets the pads, the braces down on the ground. And so that tractor was sticking up in the air, literally. I mean, everything had washed out from underneath it, and there was a big pile of brush on the upper side of it, great big pile where they had washed in. And so very, very, very carefully, I backed out, and there was another mammoth.
Oh my gosh!
It was a female, about 50 years old, and in the mid 18th century, 19th century, well, latter 18th century and early 19th century, when mammoths or mastodons were found, their tusks were out like this. So the pictures, the drawings show the tusks going out.
They're wide and they point outwards.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because they, in the process of decomposition, they slipped over. They should have been straight out. Well, this had done that, and the top of her skull was washed away. I mean, it was just because of the water, the top of the skull was gone. But there was, and we were able to recover, probably guessing, 90% of the bone material, because it had gotten down to a certain point and blocked up. So we recovered most of it. But putting it back with the right animal, now that's another story. That's going to take years, but it can be done. But what was the surprise, blew my mind, was that on that west wall, there was a female, 45 years old, that had a juvenile on top of her tusk. She was trying to extricate this animal when she went down. Well, we had Baylor PR department had convinced me to go ahead and have a media day. And sure enough, it was a slow day because every media outlet in Texas was there. And that was when we had the first 16.
Okay.
16 total. And they were good about it. They didn't press the location at all, and we had coverage all over the world. We had papers, at least acknowledgments from Japan and Korea, Europe, Australia. So it was a big deal. And one of my colleagues, who I'd only known by his publications, called and said, "Calvin, can I come look at your site?" It was Gary Haynes, Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Gary Haynes, who had been at Smithsonian for several years and on a National Geographic Society extended grant, spent almost 10 years in Africa, observing the behavioral patterns of modern elephants. And he was one of the very first people to identify these low guttural sounds that elephants make talking to each other over a mile
Mm-hmm.
away. That was some of his work. And also the fact that they revisited death scenes and would pick up a bone. And that's where the old adage of there was somewhere a boneyard. What they were doing was simply nuzzling that bone from a memory standpoint. Absolutely amazing animal. But he was the world's expert, bottom line. And he came and told us three things that really gave us a perspective of the site and directed us directly into what we were working on. First, he said it was a nursery herd. And that if we found a bull, it would be a herd bull, and if he didn't get away. In other words, implying that the male of the species would try to save himself. Then secondly, that it was an instantaneous catastrophic event, that there was a mud flow. That otherwise, and this is really important because I've been challenged on this, and of course it's still stuck in my craw a little bit, that these animals died from a drought. No, we don't deny that they were probably in a drought situation. But if they were in a drought and that's the way they died, they would have been spread out all over. They wouldn't have been in one location. Secondly, we had about half of the adults in what we call a sudden death syndrome position. That means when they're shot through the head, they'll fall straight down like this with their heads upright. And we had at least 5 of the ones that we were working on in that sudden death syndrome position. So that meant that they had to have been held upright by the amount of mud flow that was there. Otherwise, they'd have been on their side if they'd have just died in a natural situation. Mm-hmm. So it was a reveal to us that he was right on. And then the third thing he said, we really ought to have a symposium, international symposium. And I said, yeah, that sounds good. He said, well, Calvin, put that together for me. So we did. And in 97, as I recall, we held mammoths, mastodons, and human interaction. And we had all the big dogs here. I mean, it was just from Dennis Stanford to Gary Haynes, who was our keynote speaker, by the way. But it was an extraordinary event, and it took me 3 years to put together the money to do the proceedings of that symposium. But we were able to do that. But we lost some papers of the presenters because they wanted to go ahead and publish before the 3-year period. Haynes held his up, and Webb, and a lot of others did. Shipman, all the big ones. So it was, in fact, it was called the Woodstock of Proboscidean Research. So it was a great effort on our part. It was very difficult, but it was a great effort. Back to where we were. This 45-year-old female trying to extricate a juvenile was the first of its kind in paleontological history, and so that was a key, if you will, to us getting not just the recognition but also grant money. But I will say that the other triad of the supporters and helpers was Gary Cartwright of the Cooper Foundation. It took me a long time to get him out there, but he kept giving me money, and I kept accepting. He told me one time. He said, "Calvin, you're the only one that can get money out of me for digging a hole and then getting some more for covering it up." But he was great, very, very great supporter. Cooper Foundation. Every time I went to him, that's no lie. Every time I went to him, he approved the request. And so
this initial round of attention that came in the mid '80s when you let press in, I mean, obviously one of the benefits of that is it does open up some funding opportunities, which you were in desperately need, because you talked about this work, but you and David are the only one getting any money for it. It's all volunteer driven.
Yeah, and we didn't. All we got was our salary from Baylor. Yeah, that was it. Almost every bit of it was volunteer time from our end too. Yeah. I couldn't get out. I was teaching 9 hours a semester plus the museum, and so it was a pretty big job.
Yeah.
So we had to decide, since our parachute wore out over that used as a tent, and then I got a small grant from Cooper Foundation to after the flood, which in the hindsight was a big deal for also being able to protect the site. It wasn't so much at that point vandals. It was the fact that we could lose this site if we don't do something. So I went to Jerry Cartwright. I called him Jerry, and said, Jerry, we need to put a diversion dam above the site so that the water will be diverted around the site. And then we need to put up a fence. And I don't remember the exact amount, but it was substantial, like $13,000 to do that. And so we did that. And that's when, in the process of the removal of the dirt to put the diversion dam up, the workers found a mammoth tooth, just a singular tooth, which is not uncommon. Let me go on another tangent. The way we knew that statistically we were dealing with both mammoths and mastodons. Now, mastodons are a forest animal restricted to primarily the eastern part of the United States. Mammutus columbii, or Columbian mammoths, are found throughout the northern part of North America and into Mexico. They are a grazer. They're not a browser like the mastodon. Now, neither one of those species are Mammutus primigenius, which is the woolly mammoth. They were restricted to the northern latitudes, heavily furred. I wish I'd have pulled my fur out from Russia to show you the mammoth fur. But in our case, it was strictly Mammutus columbii, which is common, I would say, from South Dakota, Nebraska south in the plains. But these mastodons were showing up. their teeth were showing up. These are mastodont, hump-toothed or large tooth, very distinctive, totally different from the grazer, which has a flat tooth. And there was a lady who came by the museum and wanted to talk about mammoths, and I was always willing to talk about mammoths. And she said, "You know, I have 100 mammoth teeth." And I said, 100? And she said, "Yes, I go out to FM's gravel pits, and when he's not looking, I pick up these teeth." And 18% of those 100 were mastodon teeth. So whether or not they looked at each other across the Brazos River,
Wow.
I'm not sure. But they
Yeah.
were here. And the timing is, suspect on everybody's mind. But they were certainly alive and well until 10,000 years ago. But we didn't have any mastodon at our site. So we had decided that without good protection, we had also one of my last courses that I taught was on museum physical facilities, and we designed a structure that would go over the site as a class. And one of those students went on to do her master's thesis on enclosed Povicidian sites. She went actually, I guess megafauna sites, because she didn't just restrict herself to mammoths, but a lot of the sites she visited were mammoth sites, including Hot Springs, South Dakota site, where they have found now over 50 mammoths and one mastodon, I understand, but it was over a long time period. It was a trap. It was a natural trap where, and these old minds get to you. You just wait. Larry Agenbrod was director up there, and he was the one that excavated from the very beginning. And Larry used to say that was the hot rod syndrome, because most of the animals were young juveniles and young males who were testing themselves, getting down in there and figuring it out. So, but it was over a very long time period. So we still had, as Gary Haynes said, the largest concentration of a single herd dying from the same event known to science at that point.
Calvin, I want to ask here, just because it sounds like you became convinced early on that it wasn't a kill site. When do you think in this your work on the site early on, when do you feel like you kind of came to that conclusion that it probably was not a kill site?
Well, we very carefully excavated from the first five. We very carefully excavated and screened, and I would say up to number 12. They were very concentrated, and there would have been something there. It would have just been no question that if there was that many in that location, that close confinement, that there would have been artifacts because of butchering, at least butchering, if not kill. So we had to make the decision to go ahead and what we call make everything known as far on paper as to where everything was. In other words, we cited it in. I used one of my former students again, who had his own cultural resource management firm and was doing archaeology. He brought his humans and equipment in, and we did the profile of where they were, both horizontally and vertically. And so we knew where everything was, and we could replace it either by cast or the original material if it was covered. So we set out to remove everything that had been exposed. And it was a great experience because I had my students out. We had the Paleontological Society of Dallas, which was the premier society in Texas. And we had a lot of volunteers locally from the Central Texas Archaeological Society and just a lot of interested people to help. And it was the process of, I would have purchased acid-free paper and put on it first, but we didn't have that. So we didn't use newspaper because it'll fade and go into the bone. But we did use a paper that was plain, and we then put toe sacks, if you will, over that, and then plastic jacketed everything. And if it was a large piece, we put 2x4s, sometimes crossways, so we could handle it and get it over. And then we did, let me tell you about, I can't remember what number it was, but there was a 50-year-old female. And she obviously was mature. I mean, and of course, you're talking about an animal that can live to be 65 years old in the wild. And she was on her left side, and she was pointed upslope, just like that 45-year-old female with the juvenile. Only the juvenile was not on that same level. He was up above that. So that female and that juvenile were headed up somewhere, and she was right to the right of them, and so we started getting ready to cast her, and you have to go underneath enough to make sure that it's not going to break or anything. You put the field cast underneath them jacket, and I got underneath her left side, and I was trying to find the end of the tusk so we'd make sure we got it. And I was crawling around there trying to find that daggone tusk, and it wasn't there. And I said, her left tusk is gone. And of course, everybody laughed. And so we took her out, and sure enough, it had been broken off and heavily worn, which was another indicator that they were under severe environmental stress. Because if it had been just broken, like a bull in fighting, it would have been jagged. It wouldn't have been smoothed off like that. But we we went ahead and, I'll get that in a minute. We went ahead and took all those out, put them in the museum. Actually, it was not the museum because we didn't have room. We had the old O'Grady warehouse. And so that became our bone place. Got a lot of kidding about that. As well as mammoths under the tent, the circus tent. We got a lot of kidding about that. But it was a big job, and I felt good about it at the time because we were observing some deterioration from the elements. Just couldn't be helped, And I, in fact, I understand I was criticized for that in a paper that was given. But we were doing the best we could with no money, and trying to get things, save the site and present it and get something done there to save it. But I'll be honest with you, I couldn't sleep at night. I was turning, tossing, because where were those two animals going? Where were they headed? And so I went back to FEM, and Ralph and I talked about this. We had a lot of work to do. We had to, because that was the brushy end. That was where all the trees was on that west end. The other part was pretty well easy to do. So we had to do, weeks of cleaning just to get to the dirt. And so I borrowed another backhoe from FM, and the first thing that happened, funny now, the hose that controls all of your lifting and digging and everything blew out, and the hydraulic fluid just was all over.
Do we have a photo of that? Do we have a no?
No, Ralph never did take any photos. But anyway, we fixed it and we got back to work. And from the time that I started actually doing the process from the edge of where that 45-year-old female and juvenile were, I started right there and started coming up the bank. And within 30 minutes, I found a flake of bone in the bucket.
Wow.
About like
Okay.
I saw it. And I got pretty good. I could probably pick up a dime with that bucket, So I was being very observant. So I backed off. We went down. Ralph and I were the only ones there. And I took a picture of the trowel pointing to the bone. And we started clearing that off. And there was the largest metatarsal I've ever seen. It was about this long and about that big around.
Okay, so you're holding it up. Our listeners can't see that. So it was you said about 2 feet long? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, not
18
quite.
inches
18 inches and probably 4 inches in diameter. And that's just the toe bone. So Ralph and I looked at each other and said, bull.
Yeah.
We got the bull. But it was a year later that we got to the head end to make sure it was a bull. 1 year to excavate that one mammoth. But it was and Ralph, by that point in time, we had lost a lot of our regular volunteers. And so Ralph, bless his heart, he was out there all the time. I just gave him the key.
Yeah.
Go.
Now, when is this on the timeline? When is,
Yeah, let me look.
You can just tell me generally. Is this late 80s or, late 80s?
Yeah, it was, well, in fact, I said the symposium wrong. It was 87.
Okay, not 97. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry. And then we printed the proceedings in 92. So the early part of 92, we did the proceedings. But it's here we moved everything, and primarily during the summer and fall of 90. And then I found that flake.
Okay.
91.
Okay.
91.
But
and then there was another one that came out just below that. We were concentrating on the bull, but some water came down through that side, as it usually did with just a tent there. And there was a number 18 showed up, which was a younger female. But Gary Haynes heard about the bull.
As he had predicted. Yeah.
As he had predicted. And he said, I need to come, but you need to finance it. So, okay, we're going to have another symposium, Gary. No, I brought him in as a guest lecturer. I had some funds. By the way, John and Marie Childs. John came to me. This is important. John came to me when we were relocating the village. And I was going to be sued if I ever said anything other than the Governor Bill and Barry Daniel Historic Village, but it was the village.
Another Calvin Smith contribution to the local museum landscape. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was accused of reintroducing a HUD project to Baylor. But it worked. Anyway, John came to me when we were just starting to restore some of those, refurbish those buildings. And he said, "What do you need?" And I said, "What do you mean, what do I need?" He said, "What do you need to do this work?" And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "A flatbed truck." He said, "Go find one." And I did. And he was part of our effort to build a new museum,
yeah.
Mayburn Museum,
I see.
from that point forward. He
Yeah.
and Marie said, "Do you have an associates program, a friends organization?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "How many members you got?" I said, "2." So it became her objective to build that up, and she did. I think people were afraid to meet her on the street. They'd cross the street to keep from getting to her. But anyway, both those people are priceless. I mean, they did more to help me and encourage me on the whole thing, not just the Mammoth side or not just Ollie Moine or the village was a different story. But no, it was one of those most memorable and most important parts of my career there. So after we got, well, let me go with Gary. He came back and he had predicted that the bull would be in its mid 50s. He said if there's a bull there, he'd be in his mid 50s. He was 55 years old. And that's when he said, this is probably the most important paleontological site in the world today. And I used it from that day forward. I mean, I used it every chance I got. Now let's go back to the challenges of the property, because Hepmanchek sold it to Sam Jack McGlasson. Now Sam Jack became mayor of Waco, but he was really interested in this site. I mean, personally interested. It wasn't just, hey, there's a good tourist attraction. It was his interest were real. And he called me in on his deathbed. Cancer, not much time to live. And he said, Calvin, go out and stake what you need to preserve that site. So I went out and I didn't know how much I had, but I staked it out to where we could have an entrance. It would cover the site and the drainage, and then cut it off on the northwest corner. It was 4.93 acres. And he said, well, write it up and I'll donate it. And I said, would you be willing to donate it to the city? Oh, hell no. I said, but Sam Jack, I said, I can get money through, and I don't remember the name of the program. It was part of that tobacco tax thing, where they were improving the parks and recreational areas. I said, I can get some of that money, but it has to come through the city. Oh, well, okay. You know, it was very reluctant to do that. But so that's the way, in all honesty, the city got involved, was they took the property. And then I had a call from a gentleman that owned a couple of 3 banks and a couple of 3 TV stations, and primarily what was it? An airplane. But anyway, he said, come by my office and let's talk about that Mammoth site. We'd gotten a lot of publicity. In fact, I had been on the Channel 25 every month for
talking about work at the site. And
and Don Marion. I was on Don Marion's show. And so I walked in and he handed me $100,000 check. And he said, we'll talk about that later. And so I looked over on his desk and there was a pile of books about like this on mammoths. So he had read just about everything that was available at that point in time on mammoths. And so we discussed the site. a lot, a couple hours, and I looked over on his computer and I saw a screensaver that said Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. And I said, "You a hunter?" "Oh yeah." "Been hunting elk?" "Yeah." "Done pretty well." "Ain't never killed one." So I said, "Well, it just so happens I've got a friend up in Ocatay, New Mexico that's wanting me to come up there. He has them in his backyard, maybe his front yard. Let's go." He meant right then we'd walk out of his office, get in his plane, and fly up there. And I said, "No, I'll have to make some arrangements, but we'll get up there." And this is interesting. So we did get in his beautiful plane, and I was sitting in the co-pilot seat with white knuckles because here was a 80-something-year-old man flying this plane, and I was a co-pilot. So we flew up, and we approached Las Vegas, New Mexico, just south of Ocatay, and he kept calling the ground, come in, you know. And finally, this kid comes on the mic and says, "Don't land on the main runway. Don't land on the main runway. We're working on it." So Mr. Bostic does a wing over, comes in with this humongous plane and lands on a strip about this long and about that wide. And he says, "I don't usually make approaches like that, but I felt pretty comfortable. I trained P-51 pilots in World War II." He was an amazing man, absolutely incredible. But I was told beforehand that not only did he never let a dollar go, he never let a penny go. You know, he was known for his frugality. And but the next year, on about the same time period, about the end of December, I got another call from him, and we'd been in contact a lot. He said, "Come by my office. I've got something for you." He gave me another $100,000.
So Calvin, you spent some time with him. Why do you think his generosity on this particular project? Why do you think he got so invested, literally, in this effort?
I think it was dual. I think he started to trust someone, and because I wasn't after it to start with, that it was something that I was committed to, and he appreciated that. And then it was something of interest to him, great interest to him. But he was an amazing person, and we remained friends till his death. You know, it was good. And then there was Don and Pam Mose. What I was trying to do was buy the 100 acres that I knew we had to have for a national monument. We had to have that much access and land to be able to even go to the Park Service and say, we're ready to be considered.
Before we get to that, when did that idea pop in your? I mean, when did that idea? Is that idea in there from the 80s, or when did that idea pop in your head about national monument status? Or
when Gary Haynes said it was the most important site in the world. Yeah. That was the seal for me. That it was that important. That it just had to be saved one way or another. And so I was trying to build this 100 acres. And at that point in time, what we call the Belgian property, which was on the edge of the highway to the north, was going to put a golf course in. They had already planned it out, drawn it up. And couldn't talk to them. I mean, they were, in Belgium. So I'd never had a chance to sit down with them. But Don and Pam Mose had tried to build a nature trail in Woodway. And they never could agree with the city and what their aspirations were to make it really special and work. And so it was kind of dropped. And when I heard about their desires and what they would like to do, I went to them and I said, "Look, we can do several things with the next donation. We can make a dock for a river taxi on the Brazos, on the uh, uh,
On the Bosque, yeah.
on the Bosque. Come up the Brazos and then up the Bosque and have a dock. You can walk from that dock up through three levels of ecology, and you can put a tower at each one and look over the area and see the various uh, biomes, ecosystems. It's an incredible opportunity, better than Woodward. And they saw it. And they gave him $125,000 to do it. Now, that hasn't been done. But I talked to them at length when I went back. And actually, Don, I didn't get to see Pam. But I talked to him about how important their gift was, and that it saved the effort. And at some point in time, I'll be addressing the foundation to try to get that done, because that was I didn't make a promise. I said that's what we'd like to do, but I would like to see that done. So I sat and looked at that bull and that juvenile on his tusk for almost a year, I guess. And I knew this guy out in Crosbyton, Texas. And he owned Mount Blanco Fossil Casting Company. And he's a latent hippie, what he is. But he's a great guy and a master at preservation. And so I called Joe Taylor and I said, Joe, can you come down? I'll pay your way, but we need to talk about this bull and this juvenile. And he had heard about the site, of course. And so he came down and I said, Joe, we need to cast this bull and this juvenile in situ, in place, so that we'll always have that, no matter what happens. Flood, vandals, whatever happens, we'll have that. And he said, you're crazy. And I said, I know that, but let's try to figure out how to do it. So he walked around the site for much more than an hour, looking at everything, and trying to size up that mammoth and that juvenile. And he came back and he said, well, if we do this and that and the other, and I had no idea what he was talking about. And I said, how much will it cost? He said, well, probably about $15,000, because of the amount of materials he needed and getting it back to his place. And so I went to Jerry Cartwright, and that was, I think, maybe the last gift he gave before we passed. And got the money, and we used it, almost every bit of it, on the materials involved. 45 different sections to that cast. Now we marked eras and color coded it and everything else. When we finally got it cast, we had to take it off. We just set them over there outside of the area. It took us a week to put that stuff back together on his trailer. I mean, it was, and really the only thing that we paid him for was his transportation.
Wow.
He didn't get hardly anything out of it. But the result is the largest field cast ever made.
Wow.
As far as I know, even today. And I gave a paper in Beijing, and I want to say that was 97, to the 30th International Geological Congress on the site and the megacast that we made. And I was sitting after my presentation the next morning. A lot of the speakers were at this hotel, and we had breakfast together. And somebody said, "Hey, did you hear that presentation on the Mammoth site yesterday?" Of course, I didn't say anything. And they talked about the three things. They talked about the largest herd, dying at the same event, nursery hurt. They talked about how important it was that it's being saved. And then they said, that cast means that we can do that anywhere. And so that was really a breakthrough from the technological standpoint of the site. And the results are now in the Mayborn Museum.
Yeah, that's right.
Walk over. I have proposed to the foundation, and Joe has given us a price on that as well, and that is to make a frame that's not too obvious and put that juvenile back on that tusk, so that people can see where that juvenile was. And the reason we moved it was because it was in danger. It was higher than anything else. It was not as stable, and the skull had fallen over and was catty-cornered. And so we removed that juvenile so we could cast the rest of that tusk that was underneath it. So that all has been put together, and that's what's in the museum. Trying to think now. Let me look right quick, because there was something else that occurred. You saw some of the things that were happening here, and Joe came and we did that cast. We did the rest of the tusk. Oh yeah. Ralph had gotten up to the edge of the last animal we actually excavated, and that was another 50-year-old female. We had made a decision at that point in time that we were going to leave the next animal, whatever it was, in situ, so that people could see how we started to work on them, how much left would be to work on. In other words, it was a teaching experience. And so we were working on that, and Joe finds this tooth of a saber tooth. Now, it was a juvenile. It was a small tooth, but it was definitely a saber tooth, a smilodon. And then on the very top of this bulk that I had left, there was a turtle. So it was a different time period, but it was a large soft-shell turtle. We find at Blackwater Draw, at Naco, Laner, probably many other sites, Dent probably, that there was a heavy usage of turtles by these paleo people. They were easily accessible. Their carapaces could be used for boiling, not directly, but putting hot stones in the water to make hot water. So lots of turtle, but this turtle was not associated with this particular event. The other thing was a camel, which was between number 50 and the bull, and it's hard to tell. At that point, we were having a lot of mixing of the stratigraphy, like it was part of the mud flow. It was hard to follow it, and so we couldn't say for sure that the camel was directly associated. I couldn't at that time. They may have done more work on it, but I couldn't at the time. But camelops were common, as were horses, dire wolves, the American lion. We had a whole host of plasticine animals, but we did find those different species. But I got to that point, and and I had gotten enough money to buy that tent, the last one that we put up. But I retired after 20 years at Baylor in 2003, and David left. He went to the Redmond Museum, where he still is, and I had testified due to Chet Edwards' efforts I had testified to a subcommittee of the National Park Service about the site. And that's really what got the ball rolling. And Chet was the core person on that. And they passed a resolution. At that point, it was not a law, a resolution to continue to pursue this possibility of a national monument. And they directed the division director to send geologists and paleontologists out. And so that's what got the ball rolling toward the finalization of the designation. And two or three things. I'll tell you who picked up the ball when I left, and it was not a surprise because she had become just as interested as FM, and that was Gloria Young. And she helped start that foundation and the whole concept.
That's
and that's
a great
another
idea.
good interview
Yeah.
too, because she was primary and got a lot of people involved. And by the time I left, the city was not as involved as I'd hoped. I thought that we would have had more assistance, support system, if you will, from them. So Gloria had that ability to pull those people together. It became really important. The Mayburn was opened with the exhibit, which helped a whole lot. Dale Lacey became the president of the effort, and was a major player. And of course, I cover the New Guard brings it to fruition in Chapter 8 with President Obama signing.
Yeah. So Calvin is referencing there a forthcoming book. We just had a conversation. It's forthcoming in about a year. But it is a history of the Waco Mammoth site. Calvin Smith and David Lentz put this together, and really fills in a gap what we don't have, particularly the early period of the development of the site. So it's a big contribution. And Calvin doesn't retire well. I'm squad casting with him from work right now, so he doesn't retire very well. But I do want to ask Calvin. One of the last times you came back to the site was for the 10th anniversary. Can you talk a little bit about that experience for you and what that's like? Yeah.
Sure. By the way, this is my third unretirement.
He's very bad at it. Very bad at it. Yeah.
I just hadn't taken yet. I was asked to come back, and I was very pleased to do so. It was good to see what had transpired. Dean Lee North at Baylor has taken a great interest in the site and has done some work out there. And they did. Let me back all the way up, because we had a student that was majoring both in geology and museum studies. So she was one of my students and geology student. And she was doing a detailed terrace composite of where these animals were and exactly what terrace they were on, etc. And so she was boring holes all the way up from the river and getting these three terraces that I mentioned earlier about the nature trail. But then she came up above the Mammoth site, right up on top of where we entered, because the mammoths were down here, and the top of the terrace was right up here. And she bore down, and as I remember, it was 13 feet. And the core that she brought up had a mammoth ilium in it, the hip bone of a mammoth. So we knew that there was more animals there. Now we're same time period, same event. What I always thought before she did that even was that they were trying to get up and out through a ravine or draw from that flood event, that mire that they were in. And I always thought, now Haynes predicted also, I said, how many possible if they were under severe environmental stress? And he said, 35, no more than 40 in the herd. He said, probably closer to 35. So we had 20 plus, but they were under severe environmental stress, and some could have died way out, in the hinterlands. But I always thought there might be something else on up from that last one that we excavated. And then Lee North, I believe, had a student, and he was working with a student. They did some borings up there and came up with some more bone. So just outside of the current building is where they were working, and that's close to where she was working. I can't, with the building there, it's hard. Yeah. I could have pointed right to the hole before the building was there. Now let me mention the building for just a minute. It's amazing. It's done by the specs that my student put together. It's just this superb building for an open air site. But in my mind, when we were talking about doing something in the future, I was going to encompass the ravine where the first bone was found. I thought that if we could show how primitive it looked from the standpoint of what it is now with the excavation, that it would impress people from the standpoint of how much went into it to be able to get to where they are today. But that wasn't done, and we lost the data.
Know that. Yeah.
One of my biggest disappointments in my whole career was going and not being able to put my hand on that datum because it was so important. Now the question has become, and it's through some of the work that Lee has done, and he's an extraordinary scientist. Don't get me wrong; he just didn't have what we needed to work with. They put the wall between the 45-year-old female and the bull. So we lost that stratigraphy, that element. I call it my missing link, because we know what the bull was on and what he was in, but did it continue down to the female? Because that's gone. And so one of the pictures shows me trying to find that missing link. But it was a great experience, and we were able to fill in a lot of gaps for Reagan King, who's the director out there now, and it was good to get back. I mean, it was.
You can hear how. So Calvin was also the founding director of the Museum Studies program at Baylor, and you can hear your desire in there that the teaching value of the site. I mean, some of the things that you're sad may have been lost in there is some of the ways in which you could have taught with the site. And I can hear the heart of a teacher as you kind of talk about it there. Yeah.
Well, that's one reason I got out of retirement. I miss it. I miss my students. That's
it's countless the number of students that contributed to this particular project, but also, if we want to think Texas and locally in general, just the countless hours that your students put into kind of improving all sorts of sites.
We kept a record of Ralph's volunteerism for a good while, and we know that he put in 14,000 hours. And it was probably a lot.
Well, I thought it was appropriate that you dedicated the publication to Ralph. Just all the hours that he spent out there. Yeah.
Oh yeah. We wouldn't be talking about it. It'd still be a long way down the pike if it wasn't for Ralph.
Well, you've been really generous with your time. I know it's spring break. You were supposed to be in Fort Lauderdale or New Orleans. So I appreciate you sticking. Yeah.
Actually, actually, I have a possible mammoth coming out. in
Oh,
southeastern New
fantastic.
Mexico. I was going to go look at it.
Well, that's great. Well, I'm glad to know you're out there excavating something. So, well, Calvin, I do want to thank you for, of course, all your work you've always done here locally, and for joining us to tell kind of the next generation about it through the podcast.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I enjoy listening to myself.
All right, with that, we'll close.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com, and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Reach San Antonio.
This has been a Rogue Media podcast.